Good evening and welcome to this lecture talk by Noel Pearson. I'm Michael Darling, the chairman of the Centre for Independent Studies. And firstly, I'd like to record an apology from Greg Lindsay, the executive director who normally fulfills the function that I'm fulfilling this evening. He's in the Middle East at the moment and about to go to the Mont Pelerin Society conference in Istanbul. I'd also like at this stage to record our appreciation for our hosts, Macquarie Group, for providing the auditorium. And Macquarie are also going to give us a glass of wine afterwards, which is very nice of them, and hopefully a few nibbles. We're very grateful. Macquarie, through the Macquarie Foundation, have been very good supporters of the CIS in the indigenous research area. Macquarie Foundation has been very generous, very supportive and very innovative in their support, and it's been an absolute pleasure to work with them. Noel Pearson is one of those Australians who doesn't need a lot of introduction to most of you. On the other hand, when I read his biography, there's always things I didn't know that he's done, but so I'll record some of these things. Most of you will know most of this. But it's an extraordinarily full life. Noel was born in Cooktown in North Queensland. He went to primary school at the Hopevale Mission in Cape York, and then on to boarding school in Brisbane, and then on to Sydney University, where he completed both a history and a law degree. From there, he became very active in Indigenous affairs, particularly issues relating to initially land rights, working on the native title legislation, and then later on the specific issues relating to Cape York and working on the Cape York Heads of Agreement, and then in 1996 became chairman of the Cape York Land Council. Subsequently, he founded what I would recognize as a think tank, and it was called the Cape York Institute, is called the Cape York Institute. Noel was the founding director and is still closely involved, though he has taken leave to be able to work at least part of his time on a whole lot of other stuff that he does, like the Wild Rivers legislation and writing books. The format this evening is that Noel will give his talk, and then afterwards he's agreed for a question and answer session, and there are microphones down here. I'll explain how all that works when the time comes. After that, we have his books outside, his latest book, which is called Radical Hope, Education and Equality in Australia, and an earlier book, which is called Up from the Mission, Selected Writings. And the earlier book has an impossibly young-looking photo of Noel on the front, which you might. And Noel's agreed to sign books afterwards if you'd like to purchase them. So Noel, please, on behalf of everyone, would you please welcome Noel to the rostrum?
Thank you very much, Michael. Let me acknowledge the Indigenous people of Sydney and friends here tonight. Thank you very much to the CIS, who've long been friends of our agenda in Cape York Peninsula. It was my friend Stephen Scala, a board member of the CIS, who first introduced me to Frederick Hayek when he took me on a tour of his library back when I was with Arnold Bloch Liebler in Melbourne. And Stephen really introduced me to liberal philosophy. And Greg Lindsay and the CIS have been stalwart supporters of the reform agenda that we've tried to charter in Cape York Peninsula. I've come to more and more appreciate Hayek's point that the ideas battle must first be won. And I believe when the history of Indigenous reform is written in the future, the role of the CIS in helping us to chart that reform will be patent. It's not a policy region that receives a great deal of high quality interest and contribution.
Could you please get closer to the microphone?
It's not a policy area that receives a great deal of talented contribution and insight. So we've been very grateful that the CIS have, over the years, made indigenous policy a forefront agenda of the centre, and have accorded indigenous policy the kind of focus and attention that it so desperately deserves. I want to start my talk this evening with a small meditation in memory of my father. September each year, when the yellow wattles are flowering, I'm flooded with thoughts about my late father. For September is the time when the Groundhog, blue-tailed mullet, are running in the rivers and beaches of Cape York Peninsula. This year I've been as long alive without him as I had as my life's privilege to spend with him. Yet he is an ever-presence for me. And whilst it too often goes unheeded, his counsel, his counsel constantly pokes my ears. The spirits of our people lift when the Groundhog run. Men have made new galka, spears, and milbeer, spear throwers, for themselves and their young boys. When you pass an old bomb of a car overloaded with young men heading Yuwalin for the beach, to catch the Groundhog running along the inshore surf, the spears are positively bristling out of the car windows. In the weeks leading up to Groundhog season, my father would have taken me out with the old Land Rover to dig the roots of the Binnear tree, the Cooktown ironwood, Australia's densest tree, from which milbeer and other tools are also made. The collection of roots in the back of the old Land Rover would be taken back to the fireplace at home. Sitting next to the fire, my father would heat the roots over the flames. For it is the bark of the Binnear root that is wanted because it forms a natural tar. With his old-timer pocket knife, my father would scrape the bark off the roots, and after assembling a suitable quantity, he would put the scrapings into an old flour bag and boil it in a dungala, a billy can. This process turns the bark into a black tar, that is the adhesive used to fix the wire barbs to the gulka and to bind the mingo, the hook, to the shaft of the spear thrower. Pig fat would be added to the tar and the mixture beaten with a rock or heavy piece of wood to make it smooth and malleable. A shiny black bar of the precious and work-intensive tar is called galbur and can be used to make a few dozen spears. It is a precious thing which my father would keep in the shed and sparingly give a portion to whomsoever came asking for some. You could use petroleum tar or even araldite, but nothing beats the smell and feel of galbur. By the time September came around, Ngadubipa, my old father, would have a collection of beautiful new spears, made in the manner that all the Guguyimir men of my hometown make spears. You don't have to go very far to another place to find that Bamayindu, other Aboriginal people, make spears differently. Hopevale spears are distinct. They combine ancient techniques with a bamboo shaft straightened in the hot sand next to the fireplace, with fencing wire barbs sharpened to a point. The four-pronged banjar is bound together with twine and then secured with gulbor. All of the techniques, tools and materials used in their making are peculiar to the traditions of the Guguyimir people. And yet each man makes spears after their own distinct preference and style. My father made very elegant, light spears that were different to the larger, heavier spears made by my old Mukai, my eldest uncle, Willie. With our new spears and the old Johnson 6 horsepower and the small gulngoi, the boat, tied on the tray of the Land Rover, my father and I would leave in the early morning, darkness, to go to the Mackayva or the Endeavour River. We had to go early to catch the tide. It is best to start hunting as the tide is coming into the estuaries. Gangan are a pelagic fish that come to the east coast of Cape York to spawn between August and October. Then they're gone. They alternate between running along the beaches on the breaking surf and venturing up and down the rivers with the tide. When they are not running, they can be seen hovering under the branches of the mangroves just beneath the surface, often in a group, sometime by themselves. This is where you will find them if you quietly paddle your boat along the edge of the river. This is called Darangal, when the Gangan idle under the shade of the mangroves. This particularly happens at the top of the tide, so you need to be in the river hunting before the tide is in. I was my father's gate opener, firewood collector, water boy, boat tiller man, and rower, while he stood at the front of the boat with his gulka. He had good eyes and was an accurate spear thrower. Nothing beats the excitement of seeing the flash of blue under the water as you approach a group of Gangans sitting under the Darangal. Nothing is more exhilarating than hearing the choop of your father's spear fly through the air and hit home. The strong, muscular fish shaking the spear in the water, desperately trying to struggle free. A second spear would often need to be driven into the fish to secure it. The adrenaline only stops when the fish is flapping in the bottom of the boat. On the way home from these rivers, which have English names on the official map, but also have ancient names, which have no official record, we will pass a round hill rising out of the plain, whose ancient name is Damal Nupun, 1 foot, but whose official name on the map is imaginatively called Round Hill. On the left-hand side, the two flat hills are called Tabletop on the map, but are in fact Nukal Ganal and Nukal Dingur, the older and younger Nukal sisters. In the hour-long drive back home in the old Land Rover, we will pass through traditional clan estates, over rivers and creeks, past patches of rainforest, swamps, beneath mountains, each of which has a name in Guguyimir, telling of some recent historic or ancient mythic event or feature we may pass 100 place names on our day Watinbi hunting. Place names that go back hundreds and probably thousands of years, none of which can be found on the official maps of Australia. My father would be telling me about some of them, recounting what his father or some other Gugi Emidirbama told him about the place. That is how I became intimate with the land of the Gugi Emir. That land and its memories are ingrained within me from all the time I spent walking and hunting and fishing and playing there. Many Australians will not understand the existential dread I feel about my home and my people, our language and our culture. I have this evening provided only a fleeting impression of what will seem to be such prosaic treasures and pleasures. Prosaic they might well be, but I cannot tell you how fundamental they are to me and to our Aboriginal people. The British and specifically English culture and the traditions that sustain it are to our modern Australian culture like Google is to the search engine. It is the default setting of our national culture. Most Australians therefore do not appreciate the sustenance they receive from that culture and traditions. Most Australians do not understand the orientation that that culture and its traditions give to the people of the nation. That culture and its traditions so suffuses the social, cultural and political life and character of the nation that the obvious has become opaque. Be they descendants of the Britons, migrants from all over the world, or descendants of the indigenous, that culture and its traditions inform the institutional structure of the Australian nation for the benefit of all. Perhaps that is why Australians who take succour from this country's British heritage may fail to understand when a Gugu person from Cape York Peninsula says that he feels a great existential dread for his people, their language and their culture. Perhaps we Australians are too quick to say, well, that is sad, but change and language loss is the story of history, and so on and so on. My argument in Radical Hope is that we can combine liberal development with a conservative cultural determination to keep our languages and traditions. Let me now reflect on our work since the publication of my essay on Radical Hope. The principal argument we made in Radical Hope was that we needed to take charge of the education of our children to enable them to pursue what we have come to call two roads. The two roads of liberal development and cultural determination. We became convicted about the future of our people lying in a commitment to liberal development that now underpins what we call the Cape York Agenda. We believed that the future of Cape York Peninsula could not be sustained under the old progressive paradigm that had accumulated in Aboriginal policy over a long period of time. We came to understand over the course of the past decade that our people would not progress until we understood what it is that underpinned development everywhere. And that is the importance of animating the individual desire for a better life for themselves and their children. We came to understand that indeed self-interest was the great engine of progress. And we had for too long been denied the insight of liberalism, that self-interest is indeed a power for good. We came to realize how ridiculous it was that we should harbour desire for progress whilst being denied access to the most important engine for that progress, namely the animation of self-interest in the breasts of mothers and fathers on behalf of their families. That very engine that motivated all others to social progress was denied to our people. We were supposed to be a people apart, a people who were supposed to prosper via some other means. And that other means, unfortunately, came to be what the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd came to call the other regard of the advantaged. The salvation of our people came to be seen to lie in the other regard of the advantaged, rather than in the self-regard of those who desire a better life. We woke up to the fact that the prevailing culture and the nostrums that underpinned indigenous policy had denied to our people the liberal insight that it is with the animation of self-interest that our people will progress, as it has been the case for all peoples who've progressed. And in Cape York Peninsula, we are determined to shake off the legacy of the accumulated progressive thinking that had led us to believe for too long that the provision of welfare by the advantaged to the poor and the dispossessed was a road out of our predicament. Specifically in Radical Hope, we discussed the importance of the starting place being education. Our work on educational reform 10 years ago commenced when my first priority was to focus on the position of our secondary school students. Those students who had somehow managed to crash through with some modicum of achievement through these terrible primary schools in the region, and to get them into high-achieving boarding schools down south. I saw that as a necessary, urgent rescuing of those children that had managed to survive a pretty hopeless primary school education. So we were grateful for our partnership with the Macquarie Bank Foundation when the late David Clark came to me and said, we will support a private school, boarding school program, a scholarship program for your kids. And for the past 8 years, we have had dozens and dozens of students successfully go through the best private schools in Queensland. The lesson we learned from that experience was that though our children entered those schools frequently 1 or 2 or more years behind their peers, they very soon got swept up in the tide of high expectation that those schools naturally have. So the current of high expectations swept our young people along, and we've seen great success with our Higher Expectations program. Our next initiative was to say, well, our kids are succeeding what I came to call our talented 10th. We're succeeding with the Higher Expectations program, and we approached Macquarie Bank to extend the facility for those kids to pursue tertiary education. So 3 years later, we commenced Higher Expectations tertiary program. And I'm gratified to say that some of our students who succeeded in the secondary program have then gone on to study at university. One of the conditions we attached to the program was that we wanted partnerships with secondary schools that had a better than 80% conversion rate to university. We wanted our kids to enter into secondary schools that had an overwhelming expectation that children were going to go on to university studies. But all along, we were keenly aware that the situation with primary school education provided by the Queensland Education Department had to be confronted, because that is where the disaster first happens. Children who frequently attend faithfully all year round, nevertheless still receive an education that sees them 2, 3, 4, 5 years behind their mainstream peers. And this was not confined just to kids who didn't attend and who had traumatic family backgrounds. This also included the children of responsible parents who fronted their kids up, fed, well slept, and ready for education, but not receiving the education they deserved. The primary school education system was the hardest domain for us to penetrate in our reform agenda. It took us the best part of 10 years to summon up the courage to eventually say enough was enough. The publication of NAPLAN results in these past 3 years assisted us in that argument, and to finally say to the professional educators that we could no longer leave the destiny of our children in your hands. Because there'd been generation after generation of new policy paradigms published by ministers and senior bureaucrats with new budgetary allocations and commitments that proclaimed to be the final solution to the educational underachievement problem. During these past 10 years, we saw 3 iterations of what we came to call the Groundhog Day of educational reform. And it was on the 3rd iteration that we finally said, no, you don't get another chance with the kids. We deserve better for the children. Our children deserve better, the parents deserve better, and the system needs to fundamentally change. 2.5 years ago now, we travelled to the United States, having for some years prior to that become convinced that explicit instruction was missing from the teaching of reading and numeracy in our schools, because we'd ended up with this ridiculous situation where grandmothers in Cape York were more literate than their grandchildren. The older generation could read the Bible backwards, but their children could hardly write their own names. The missions had succeeded in educating people to read in their own language and write in their own language. And yet the system of the last 40 years was producing indigenous children who were illiterate in both languages. We followed the reading wars in the Australian public debate and became convinced that the explicit instruction phonics side of the war And I was particularly taken with the argument of Professor Kevin Weldahl from the Macquarie University Special Education Centre, who gave possibly the most persuasive explanation for why explicit instruction in reading is so critical. He said to us, generally in a coterie of students, the top 25% of kids will learn to read no matter what. No matter how disastrously you treat them, there are some kids who are going to learn to read no matter what. The middle 50%, Professor Weldahl said, will learn to read whatever method you employ as long as you do it competently. But he said there's a bottom 25% who will never learn to read until you teach them explicitly all of the requisite skills that go towards literacy and reading. And so we became convinced of Professor Weldahl's argument. We understood very keenly that the bottom 25% often correlates with kids with learning difficulties, but not just kids with learning difficulties. Kids from non-English speaking backgrounds, kids from families with no books in the home, kids from poor socioeconomic circumstances, and so on. Our children, overwhelmingly, seemed to fit the bottom 25%. And yet we had a teaching system that was kind of vaguely pointing somewhere in the middle, and not being delivered all that competently. And we became determined to introduce Professor Weldahl's remedial program called Multilit in a trial in Cohen that we started in 2004. And we did the Multilit trial over 2 years, and we were very pleased with the gains the children made. In fact, the way in which Multilit teaches young people to read is pretty much the way I was taught to read, and probably many people in this room. The difficulty, though, was that we were running a remedial program on the fringe of the school, whilst in the classroom proper, the children were still being taught through constructivist and whole language methods. So we were fixing up a problem that was already being caused in the main classrooms. And we became clear with that we had to influence what was happening in the classrooms. Running a remedial program was simply fixing the problem after the fact. And the problem was so vast that running a remedial program was almost a joke. Everybody needed remediation. So it became clear that we needed to get a program into the classroom. It was then that we discovered that the Multilit program and all explicit instruction programs have their genesis in a program called direct instruction. It was developed in the United States by Professor Siegfried Engelmann and his colleagues at the University of Illinois and later at the University of Oregon. And we visited the United States and met with Professor Engelmann, who has been developing the direct instruction program, and we formed a partnership with his organization called the American National Institute for Direct Instruction. That was in the second half of 2009, and we came back with a business plan to take over 2 primary schools in Cape York, Aurukun and Cohen. We had the very great fortune of being sponsored by the Vincent Fairfax Foundation, and we constructed a great business plan to argue the case that we should take over the curriculum at these schools. and we proposed the formation of the Cape York Aboriginal Australian Academy. The Cape York Aboriginal Australian Academy has an independent board, and we receive funds independently of the Queensland Government to operate the direct instruction program in partnership with the department. The department remains as a partner, as the owner of the facilities at the school, and as the technical employer of the teachers, but all of the program and all of the policies and the governance of the school is undertaken by our independent board. We have a 3-domain program called Class, which deals with literacy and numeracy and science, the Western curriculum. Club, which provides music, art, sport, and culture, which provides indigenous language and indigenous cultural knowledge programs. It is a full-day program, starting at 8:30 and finishing at 4:30. The compulsory school day ends at 2:30, but the parents, 98% of which have signed their children up, agree to extend the school day to 4:30. And we've been running the Cape York Aboriginal Australian Academy in 3 schools in Cape York Peninsula for the last 18 months. The Americans bring to the program a group of professionals who've been coaching and teaching teachers to teach reading and numeracy for an average 30 or 40 years. They are extremely expert teachers of teachers. The American program is scripted, so first-year university graduate teachers are able to deliver the program with fidelity. The program's instructional design is such that all of the requisite skills build like a staircase, step by step, throughout from prep to year 7. And the first term of the program, which I describe in a prologue to the book, was absolute nightmare. Our headbutting with the Queensland Government over whether they would allow us to do this was not concluded until Christmas Eve, the 2009. And we had to start the school up on the 28th of January the next year. So they gave us, having put a plan to them 5 months before, they gave us 28 days to get organised to start the school. We nevertheless did, in a cauldron of chaos and controversy, with teachers who refused to deliver some of the program, headmasters that were revolting against the American program, and parents who had been incited to express alarm about what was happening. The Americans introduced a comprehensive behaviour management approach along with the instructional program. They have a system of coming out every 3 months to look over the shoulders of the teachers, to coach them in the delivery. And every week, the children undertake a mastery test of what they've learned. Usually of the last 5 lessons, sometimes of the last 10 lessons. There's a mastery test. You don't move on to the next set of lessons until you get a 90% pass in the previous material. And the results of the mastery test are faxed over to the United States and to Vancouver, where the program director resides. And every Tuesday morning at 7:30, without fail, there's a teleconference between the principal at Arakoon, the program director in Vancouver, the coordinator in Eugene, Oregon, and our people in Cairns, where they go over the results of the mastery test. And they make decisions about how the program is going, how the teacher is going, whether Billy should be put up to the snake group or Susie perhaps put down to the koala group, and so on. These management decisions are taken on a weekly basis based on the data that is collected every week. And so all of the teachers come under the purview of this system. The performance of the teachers is readily apparent in the progress of the kids, because Professor Engelman's great nostrum was that if the student has not learned, the teacher has not taught, which left no alibi for teachers. If teachers have properly, with fidelity, delivered the program, there's no reason why kids should fail. Yes, kids proceed at different rates, and the DI program allows kids to proceed at their level of progress and ability. Your placement tested at the beginning. You start where you're at. And so in the earlier years in particular, the kids are placed in mixed groups according to where they're at, according to the placement test. I can tell you I was very worried late into the first term last year, because the problems did not seem to subside and the controversies continued to swirl around us. The front page of the Cairns Post declared, something like, "What a great stuff up," was the headline or something. Aboriginal students being forced to learn the Star-Spangled Banner. Apparently they could watch all these American violent DVDs to all hours of the night on Austar, but how dare they learn the Star-Spangled Banner as part of the direct instruction program? They weren't forced to learn it, by the way, but that was the beat up in the newspaper. Anyway, there was a point at which the whole cyclone in the school just subsided. There were 65 kids at the high point in the detention room, in the timeout room at one stage. And then the following week, there were 3. And a calm descended over the school. And the whole logic of the program started to reveal itself to the whole school. The principal knew what her job was. Her job was not to look after the plumber at the front desk, or the policeman looking for this, or the parent wanting to complain about that. Her job, first and foremost, was to lead instruction in the school. The principal as the instructional leader. And we were very focused on this idea that, yes, the principal has got to run around and do 1,000 jobs, but if she does not understand that her main job is to lead the instruction, she has been diverted from her main task. And so the principal knew what her primary duty was, and all the teachers knew what they had to do, and all the students knew. And the thing about the direct instruction, with the placement testing ensuring that the instruction was directed at a level that the kids could grasp and deal with. Once you direct the initial instruction at a level that the kids can deal with, they experience success. And when they experience success, their behaviour changes. Their interest engages, and they want to learn more. And they feel better about having succeeded today. And tomorrow they want to succeed again. And you get this virtuous circle forming in the minds of the kids. Urukun would have been the contender for the worst school in Queensland, contending with a lot of other schools from Aboriginal Australia. But Urukun would have given even our worst indigenous schools a run for its money. 160 times the previous year the police were called to the campus. Only 230 kids, and the police come there 160 times. Well, there's been a complete collapse in the police call-outs in the last 2 years. There's a coherence, as I say, in the school, and thankfully and gratifyingly, my own hometown put together a delegation that went up to see these schools late last year, and of their own volition, they came away with the view that they wanted the direct instruction program to start at Hopevale. And they brooked no opposition from the Education Department on that. It was the one time that I have just completely stood back and let parents advocate their own reform agenda on behalf of their children. And that was purely based on the fact that it was plain to them that the school was not delivering. They went to see for themselves with the community leaders what was happening in Aurukun, and they came back insisting that the department allow Hopevale to be included in the Cape York Academy. So we 3 down, we've got many hundreds to go. I want to say, as I close my speech here tonight, that over the past 10 months, we've had the very good fortune of being supported by our long-standing partners from the Boston Consulting Group here in Sydney and Melbourne in developing a business plan for supporting direct instruction in Australia. To have the facility here in this country to enable direct instruction to be available to disadvantaged schools in Australia, indigenous schools and non-indigenous schools. And we propose to establish an Australian Institute for Direct Instruction in partnership with the Americans. The Americans have very gratefully agreed with us to work in partnership with us, to supply us with the personnel and the expertise to enable us to create an indigenous capacity to support the introduction of DI to Australian schools that seek it. I'll say one last thing about DI. The great fortune of there's a general equivocation about direct instruction as to whether talented kids and gifted kids, as to whether direct instruction impedes them in any way. No, it doesn't. It allows them to proceed at their own pace. It's like a question of whether someone like, might I say, Jonathan Thurston, should he do ball skills? Should he practice ball skills in order to play rugby league? Well, it wouldn't hurt him. And it probably formed a very important part of his early development as a footballer. Indeed, many great composers had to get down and learn the scales in the beginning before they could unleash their great potential and creativity. The whole argument about explicit instruction is to arm kids with the skills they need in order to unleash their potential and creativity. And the great advantage of adopting a direct instruction approach, particularly, I say, in the elementary years, is that in the United States we saw all these African American children who were reading in grade 1. And they came from the ghettos. And our friends from Aurukun who came to see these prep and year 1 kids reading very proficiently said, you know, why can't our children do the same thing? And So our agenda is to make provision here in Australia, to build the expertise, to build the support, so that we can support schools in rolling out direct instruction in those elementary years. We believe that by year 3 for many kids, or by year 5 for all kids should be armed with the complete ability to read after that. You know, it doesn't matter if it might matter to us here tonight whether they go on to read Das Kapital. The point is that by year 5, we want to arm them with the ability to read whatever. And I have to say that it's only 18 months into our story of reform in Cape York Peninsula, a story that we anticipated in my book, Radical Hope, but my colleagues and I have been working very hard to make it happen on the ground. Thank you.